The alien princess mocked the human. If he wins, I'll be his wife forever. She said it the same way she'd order a servant to refill her cup, bored, dismissive, already looking past him, and the court scribes had it carved into ceremonial stone before the laughter in the hall had even finished rolling through the rafters. Rewind 72 hours before the wager, before the trial, before a grieving human engineer had any reason on this world or any other to know what a Karathi wedding vessel even looked like. Marcus Reyes sat pressed against a shuttle window and watched the planet Oralun turn slowly beneath him. The capital city rose out of the cloud cover in stages, spires the color of weathered bronze, arranged in long looping spirals, avenues cut between them like veins through a leaf held up to light. Nothing about it looked constructed. It looked like something that had been coaxed out of the ground over centuries rather than built by anyone in a hurry. He'd spent the transit reading briefing packets, memorizing court protocol he already suspected would prove about as useful here as a raincoat in a supernova, and none of it had prepared him for the way the light moved across those towers, or the way the sprawling green canopy below softened every hard edge of the skyline into something that looked from altitude almost gentle. He hadn't planned on being the one stepping off that shuttle. 3 weeks earlier, the senior human ambassador assigned to the Karathi court had collapsed at a state function on a neighboring world, poisoned, though nobody on the official channel had used that word out loud yet. Marcus was the structural engineer attached to the embassy compound, sent originally to make sure the new chancellery building wouldn't slowly sink into the planet's unstable bedrock. He'd inherited the ambassador's chair through nothing more meaningful than being the highest-ranking human still breathing in that sector of space. Nobody, least of all Marcus, believed he actually belonged in it. The Karathi welcome party met him at the landing pad, and every single one of them made him feel like a child standing among adults. The shortest of his escorts still had a clear head of height on him. Their skin ran in a gradient from pale sea foam at the wrist to a saturated emerald along the jaw and throat, and Marcus had read enough of the xenobiology briefings to know that gradient wasn't decorative. It was mood, read in real time, and he found himself watching throats instead of faces for the entire walk from the pad to the palace gates. He noticed other things too, the way an engineer notices things, not because anyone had trained him to look for them, but because it was simply how his mind organized any new environment it was dropped into. The escort formation itself was deliberate rather than casual, 2 Karathi walking a half pace ahead of him, 2 trailing at precisely the same interval behind. The whole arrangement built to steer his sightline through the capital's outer district without ever once looking like it was steering anything. He clocked the pattern and said nothing about it, the same quiet instinct that had once told him which support beam in a 40-year-old warehouse was failing long before anyone else in the room. Noticed the ceiling had begun to sag over their heads. Whatever this world turned out to be underneath its ceremony, he understood already that it ran on structure the same way any building did, just structure built from inherited protocol and old memory instead of steel and poured stone. The walk from the landing pad to the Citadel's outer gate took the better part of 20 minutes, and not one member of his escort spoke to him the entire way. He didn't take it personally. He suspected, correctly as it turned out, that the silence itself was a kind of test, the first of a great many he wouldn't recognize as tests until he was already standing inside them. The sovereign citadel dominated the heart of the capital, the way a cathedral dominates a medieval town square, except built at a scale that made cathedrals look modest, 7 ascending tiers, domes cast from some alloy Marcus couldn't place. Terraced gardens cut 100 meters above street level, where trees he had no name for swayed in wind he couldn't feel from the ground. He was walked through it with the careful, affectionless precision of a stray dog being escorted through a museum that valued its exhibits far more than its visitor. They brought him into the throne hall with no ceremony at all. Karathi nobles stood arranged in 2 long curves along a floor of polished black stone, and conversation didn't stop suddenly when the human delegation entered. It died the way wind dies ahead of a coming storm, all at once and somehow gradually. Marcus felt the entire room take his measure in a single sweep. Height, shoulders, the set of his hands, the lines already starting at the corners of his eyes. Whether he was built to break or built to burn, the sovereign sat at the far end of the hall on a low, unadorned seat, not a throne, a chair, and that single detail told Marcus more about the true character of this court than every page of his briefing packet combined. He was an old man by Karathi standards, his skin faded to a pale sage with age, a long scar tracing his forehead down across one cheek, eyes the color of hammered gold. He rose to meet the humans, which visibly caught half the gallery off guard and greeted them in careful practiced Terran. "You are welcome under my roof," he said, extending a hand, not the way a king extends a hand to a subject, but the way one man offers a hand to another he intends to respect. Marcus took it. The skin was warm and drier than a human's, the grip firmer than he'd expected from someone that old. A few formal courtesies passed between the delegations. Marcus said what the briefing scripts told him to say, and spent the rest of the exchange quietly cataloging the room, house sigils along the gallery, which nobles leaned a half step forward and which held a half step back, the same instinct he used walking a construction site, hunting load-bearing walls and hairline cracks before anyone told him where to look. He didn't register the woman entering behind him until the entire hall went silent for a second time. She came into a room the way a blade enters a conversation, sudden and impossible to ignore afterward. Marcus turned. She was tall, even measured against her own towering people, her skin the deepest green he'd seen in the city so far, darkening almost to black along her jaw and the hollow of her throat in the low torchlight. Half her head was shaved close to the scalp. The rest of her hair fell in a single, unbroken sheet of pale silver over one shoulder. She wore a formal robe the color of dried rust, cut to bare the long, corded muscle of her arms, and a flat circlet of dark metal sat across her brow, plainer, Marcus noted, than he'd have guessed a crown princess would wear. Her eyes were gold, several shades brighter than her father's, and they didn't flinch from anything in that room, including him. Her gaze swept the hall, passed over the human delegation the way a searchlight passes over an empty warehouse looking for something worth stopping on, found nothing, kept moving, then doubled back. Not out of interest, but inspection. "Father," she said, voice low, and carrying easily across stone. "Is this the replacement ambassador?" "This is Marcus Reyes," the sovereign said, "of the human embassy." "Ah!" She said it the way one might comment on a servant bringing the wrong vintage. The short-lived one, a ripple of laughter went through the younger nobles along the gallery. The older one stayed silent, which Marcus filed away without yet understanding what it meant. He stood where he stood. He didn't smile. He didn't answer. "I've encountered their kind before," she continued, playing now for the gallery rather than for him specifically. "Bones like dry kindling. Decisions made and unmade inside a single breath. Their treaties barely outlast an afternoon." Her gold eyes settled on him again, steady and unhurried. "Their entire species will have burned itself out before the paint on my formal portrait finishes drying." The silence that followed had actual weight to it. Marcus understood, somewhere in that stretch of quiet, that none of this performance was really aimed at him. It was aimed at her father, some old, unresolved argument between the two of them being fought out in a language Marcus hadn't learned yet. Using his body as the surface, the words happened to bounce off. He understood it, and he made a decision not to answer. The room was clearly hungry to watch him flinch. Refusing to give them that was the cheapest, easiest gift he had available to hand out, so he gave it. He held her gaze and said nothing, and watched the green along her throat deepen in response. She read the silence as contempt. He could see the exact moment she decided that's what it meant, and he chose not to correct her, because nothing he could say in that hall was going to make the moment better, and plenty could make it considerably worse. The sovereign exhaled slowly through his nose, a sound Marcus recognized instantly because his own late father had made that exact noise across a chessboard more than once, watching his own child sacrifice a piece she never needed to give up. "Daughter," the sovereign said lightly, pitched for the whole gallery to catch. "Find yourself a more worthy way to pass an evening." Naira Varn, crown heir of the Karate Dominion, smiled for the first time since entering the hall. It was not a warm expression. "I will," she said, and stepped into the center of the floor. This was, Marcus would learn a moment too late, the precise spot in karate ceremony reserved for formal declarations, oaths sworn, judgments handed down, futures rearranged. He felt the entire hall reorganize itself around her. The instant her boots touched that particular flagstone, whispering stopped outright. The gallery leaned forward as one body. Whatever she was about to say next, this room had clearly been trained across generations to take it seriously the moment it left her mouth. "I invoke the right of three," she said. The words landed like a dropped stone into still water. An elderly nobleman 2 rows back sat forward and muttered something in the old tongue that Marcus's translator didn't catch fast enough, and the sovereign lifted one hand for silence, though his gold eyes had narrowed to something considerably harder than courtesy. "The last invocation," Naira continued, deliberately switching to Terran, so Marcus couldn't miss a syllable of it, was some 190 years past. "The last invoked by a member of the ruling house closer to 400. The right remains on the books. The right remains binding." She turned fully to face him. "I invoke it against the new human ambassador." Marcus said nothing. He was still cataloging. "The terms," she went on, "will be kept simple, out of consideration for a species that struggles with anything more complex than that." A ripple of laughter from the younger nobles again. "Should the human survive the right of 3, I, Naira Varn, daughter of the sovereign, will become his wife. Before the full assembly of the court, F-bound forever." The hall held its collective breath. The word forever hung there in the air, like a hammer paused at the very top of its swing. Laughter broke first from the noble houses who stood to gain the most from watching her humiliated, then spread to the younger courtiers who had no real idea what the right of three actually demanded of a candidate. The older nobles, the ones who'd actually read the historical record, didn't laugh at all. They watched her the way men watch a controlled fire that has just jumped its containment line. Marcus stood very still and studied the shape of the trap laid out in front of him, because that was, after everything else, still what he was, an engineer trained to look at any structure and find the exact point where a single hidden stress would tear the whole thing apart. This was precisely one of those points. Refuse her, and the human delegation would read it as cowardice, while the Karathi read it as open contempt for one of their oldest traditions, and the trade accord he'd been sent here specifically to secure would be strangled before the ink ever touched parchment. Except, and she plainly expected him not to survive long enough for the question to matter, he raised his voice for the first time since walking into that hall. "What happens," he said, "if I lose?" It was a small, plain question, and it cut cleanly through the laughter like a blade through cloth. The court's chief magistrate, a gray-skinned elder in long silver robes, stepped forward and read the answer directly off a handheld data slate, flat and clinical, the way a physician reads out a terminal diagnosis. Exile for the human, withdrawal of the entire embassy for a full generation, collapse of the trade accord outright. The Karathi dominion would refuse any further human delegation until the sovereign's own grandchildren had grown old. Marcus looked at the princess. She was watching him the exact way a cat watches a bird that has just realized every window in the room is sealed shut. "I accept," he said, quietly, and he felt the whole hall tilt slightly on its axis, because not everyone in that room had actually expected him to say yes. Neera had, but she'd expected a performance to go with it, some blustering human speech about courage. Instead, he'd agreed to it with roughly the same energy he'd have used confirming a dental appointment, and he watched the green along her collarbones darken sharply in response, and understood he'd just scored a point in a game she didn't yet realize the two of them were playing. The ceremony that followed had a name Marcus's translator rendered clumsily as the Binding Assembly, though he'd come to think of it privately as the Moon Court. F3 silver rings were lowered one by one into a cup of dark ritual wine held by 3 white-robed magistrates, while the oath was read aloud, first in the old Karathi tongue and then in careful Terran, and Marcus had to step forward and sign his own name in characters he'd spent exactly 3 weeks practicing. He wrote them slowly. He hadn't practiced quite enough, and he knew it while he was doing it. Naira watched him form each stroke, and her mouth did the thing that on a human face would have read as an open sneer, as though his careful, unhurried handwriting simply confirmed every claim she'd already made about his entire species out loud. He didn't try to correct her on that either. He finished the last stroke, set the stylus down, and stepped back. Witnesses from 6 of the noble houses came forward in turn to countersign. The sovereign signed last, and Marcus caught the half-second his pen hesitated above the parchment before he committed to it. A hesitation the rest of the hall, watching the princess instead, entirely missed. Then the old man signed, and the wine was poured out across the polished stone floor, spreading slowly in a dark stain like a shadow settling in to stay. The rite of 3 would begin at first light, 2 days out from that night. The hall emptied by degrees after that. Nobles bowed to the sovereign and withdrew in their small clusters. The human delegation retreated with what dignity it could still muster, which by that point wasn't a great deal. The princess didn't look at Marcus again before she left, exiting through the far side of the hall opposite the one she'd entered by, the gold torchlight seeming to follow her all the way out. Marcus walked the citadel's outer gardens alone that night. The terraces stepped down toward the city in long cascades of dark grass and moving water, and the night air up there smelled faintly of some unfamiliar spice he had no name for. He stopped at a low stone balustrade and looked out over the sleeping capital. The bronze towers held the last color of the day long after the actual sun had gone down, glowing faintly like coals settling in a hearth, and for one long quiet stretch of minutes he managed to stop thinking about the oath he'd just signed at all. "Human," said a voice behind him in halting Terran. He turned. An old Karathi servant stood at the garden's edge, half swallowed by shadow, skin gone pale with age, wearing the plain gray of palace staff, a cleaning cloth and rod still in her hands. He hadn't heard her approach at all. "No outworlder," she said, "has ever survived the first trial." "Noted," Marcus said. "No outworlder," she continued, as though he hadn't spoken at all, "has ever even reached the third." "Also noted." She studied him for a long moment, with the particular stillness of someone who'd spent 5 decades learning how to become invisible in rooms full of powerful people. Her name, he'd learn much later, was Eshe. He wouldn't forget it after that. "Good fortune, human," she said, and went back to polishing the stonework she'd apparently been working on the entire time. He'd been standing there lost in his own head. Marcus walked back to his rooms, set a small piece of scorched metal on the table beside his bed, a fragment he carried everywhere and rarely explained, and sat with it a long while without managing any real sleep. The first trial, Endurance Dawn on the appointed day came up the color of old bronze. They took him to the trial of the body first. The arena was a circular sand pit sunk into the floor of an old garrison at the capital's eastern edge, ringed by stone tiers packed with nobles and military officers. F. Marcus stood at the pit's center, in nothing but a dark wrap around his waist, bare feet in cold sand, shoulders bracing against the morning chill while the stands filled in around him. The princess sat in the royal gallery above, wrapped in a dark green robe that nearly matched her own skin, the same plain circlet at her brow, gold eyes fixed on his face from the moment he stepped onto the sand and never once wandering elsewhere. His opponent entered through the opposite gate. Torvak Sel was a karate champion of the old school, a full head taller than any human Marcus had ever met, built nearly twice as broad through the chest, a body constructed for exactly one purpose and trained relentlessly toward it. His skin was deep mossy green, streaked with old silver scarring across the ribs, and he carried himself with the quiet, settled confidence of a man who had never once lost. He nodded to Marcus with something that read almost as courtesy, a courtesy that plainly meant, "I have no wish to kill you, and I won't, but I intend to hurt you until you're the one who asks me to stop." A small bell rang. It wasn't really a fight, and Marcus understood that inside the first exchange. He trained in combat the way most human engineers posted to deep space did, trained to get out of a fight, not to win one. Torvak wasn't an opponent Marcus could realistically strike. He was a wall Marcus could throw himself against until something eventually gave, and it wasn't going to be Torvak. So Marcus didn't try to land a hit. He closed the distance, he let himself get caught. He let himself get thrown, hit the sand hard across the length of his back the first time, heard the crowd's collective exhale. He got up, he closed again, he got thrown again, harder this time into the stone wall of the pit, and felt a rib on his left side shift crooked against the impact. He got up, he closed again. By the 5th fall, the arena had gone quiet. By the 8th, Torvak had stopped smiling. By the 10th, the big champion stepped back and looked up toward the magistrate, and Marcus caught the low words he said in his own tongue, rendered by the translator on his wrist as simply, "End this." The magistrate glanced toward the royal gallery. The princess didn't move. Marcus spoke through blood on his teeth. "Ring it," he said when it's supposed to ring. Torvak studied him for a long beat, then stepped forward and threw him one more time, gentler now, almost apologetic, careful not to add further damage, and Marcus got up again anyway. The bell rang. The crowd didn't cheer. They sat in the specific silence that follows something happening that wasn't anywhere on the day's expected schedule. The magistrate raised a hand. "The human endures," he announced. "The first trial concludes." Marcus bowed as ritual required and walked out of the arena on his own 2 legs, carrying his weight badly along one side, every breath tugging at the crooked rib, but walking. He didn't look up at the royal gallery on his way out. He didn't need to. He could feel her watching him leave regardless, and later he'd learn that for the first time all morning, the green along her throat had gone visibly paler. The second trial, the turning halls, they gave him 6 hours. He spent most of it in a medical ward with his ribs bound tight, and when they came for him at the second bell, he was already on his feet, waving off the painkiller. He couldn't afford to move slow. Esha found him in the corridor outside the ward, on her way past with an armful of fresh linens, and she stopped when she saw him standing there testing his weight against the bound rib, deciding whether it would hold him through whatever came next. "You endured the sand," she said. It wasn't a question. Barely. Barely is the only way anyone has ever endured it. She studied him a moment, the same unreadable stillness from the garden 2 nights earlier. The turning halls will not care how barely you manage the first trial. They will ask you a different question entirely. What question is that? Whether you know how to be lost without becoming afraid of it. She shifted the linens against her hip. Most who fail the second trial fail because fear makes them loud inside their own skulls. They cannot hear the hall speaking because they are too busy listening to their own panic instead. Marcus turned that over for a moment. And if a person isn't afraid of being lost, then perhaps, as she said, already moving on down the corridor, the halls have something worth telling him. She didn't look back before disappearing around the corner, and Marcus stood there a moment longer turning the exchange over before deciding to take her seriously enough to remember it as he walked toward the second trial's entrance a short while later. The second trial waited in the oldest wing of the citadel, a war in the court called the Turning Halls, built, according to legend, by an architect whose name and house had both vanished from the record 3 centuries before the current dynasty had even taken the seat. It was a threaded network of ritual chambers folded through the lower levels of the palace, corridors that doubled back on themselves, doorways cut into stone at angles that made no architectural sense whatsoever. No complete map of it existed anywhere. Every candidate who'd ever attempted it had come out, on the rare occasions anyone came out at all, describing a different sequence of turns entirely. The magistrate led him to the entrance, a single arched doorway lit by one thin green flame in a wall sconce. "You will be observed," he said. "You will not be aided. The trial ends when you locate the sealed chamber. Average completion runs 11 hours. The record stands at 6. Marcus stepped through the arch. The first thing he did once inside was stop walking entirely. He stood in the opening corridor, closed his eyes and listened. Most candidates, he suspected, treated a maze like this as a visual puzzle, walking the halls, memorizing every turn, trying to build a picture from what they could see. That was almost certainly the trap baked into the whole design, a labyrinth engineered by people who understood resonance and airflow the way a builder understands load. That kind of structure was never going to yield to eyes alone. And Marcus had been reading load paths through old buildings since he was 16 years old. He was a structural engineer before he'd ever been anything else, including an ambassador. He felt the air currents first, a faint draft moving through the loose cuff of his sleeve, left to right, slightly warmer than the corridor air, which meant it originated from a larger open chamber somewhere deeper inside the structure. He followed it. Where it forked, he pressed his palm flat against the stone and felt for the low hum of settling air moving through the walls themselves, and followed that instead. 3 hours in, he found a doorway that had been deliberately plastered over. 4 hours in, a hatch cut into the floor that no karate had used in at least a century, covered by a loose paving stone that rocked faintly under his weight when he tested it. 5 hours in, he was standing inside the sealed chamber. It was small and square, stone on all 6 sides, lit by a single lamp at its center, beside a wooden stand holding an open ledger. Marcus stepped closer and looked down at the page. His own name was written there, not in karate script, but in Terran characters in his own handwriting. He recognized it instantly, because he'd signed that exact shape 2 nights earlier in the throne hall. He stood with a hand braced on the stand for a long, quiet moment. The karate kept an old legend, he'd learned afterward, that the labyrinth wrote the names of its true winners into its own record before they ever set foot inside it. He didn't believe the legend. He looked at the page, looked at his name, considered every other explanation available to him, and set the whole question aside for later. The magistrates found him not long after. He'd cleared the trial in just under 5 hours, a new record, half the expected time. In the royal gallery, while he'd worked the maze, the princess had sat watching the relay screens without a single word for 4 hours and 40 minutes straight. She hadn't smiled once through any of it. Her father had noticed, her father had said nothing about it. The final trial waited for sunset. This was the one the Karathi never discussed openly in daylight hours. They led Marcus into a chamber at the very base of the citadel, older stonework than anything above it, handed him a single lit torch, and pointed him toward a door at the far end of a long room. Cross that room, they told him, open that door, and the trial ended in victory. The door stood 50 meters distant. Halfway across, bound against the left wall to a panel of dark metal, with her arms raised overhead, was a woman bleeding from a wound along her hairline, gagged eyes wide open and finding his the instant he entered. The panel she was bound to fed into a massive mechanism set into the ceiling above, and Marcus, standing in the doorway with the torch throwing long shadows across the stone, understood immediately what he was actually looking at. That panel was the trial's real failure point. If he took the direct, obvious route toward the victory door, the mechanism above would complete its cycle within the next 60 seconds, the panel would close, and the woman bound to it would be crushed between metal and stone. He could see the whole shape of it. He could hear the mechanism cycle grinding steadily toward completion. He could see the victory door 50 meters off, well within easy reach if he simply kept walking straight ahead. He didn't pause. He didn't run the calculation. He turned toward the bound woman and ran, and he never once looked back at that door. He tore the brackets off the panel with his bare hands and the small scorched piece of metal he carried in his pocket, a fragment of orbital hull that had belonged to his sister. The one thing harder than anything else in that room, including the old iron bracket housings. He pried her arms free just as the mechanism overhead seized ground and shuddered to a stop, and he heard, somewhere behind him, the path to the victory door slam shut for good. He'd failed. He knew it the instant it happened. He pulled the gag from her mouth and looked at her face by torchlight, and realized the blood along her hairline was paint. The wound was theatrical, staged. Her eyes were full of tears, but they were tears of relief, not pain. The ceiling opened above them, not the sound of a trap releasing, but something closer to ceremony. Stone parted along a long seam, light spilled down from the chambers above, and the chief magistrate's amplified voice followed it down. The Mercy Gate, he announced, is the third trial in full. Victory earned through victory alone is only victory. Victory earned through mercy is the true measure of the house. The woman in the panel had been a projection, an illusion constructed from light and old ritual craft. Her suffering had never been real. The test, however, had been entirely real, a lattice of sensors woven through the stone itself, reading his pulse, his breathing, the tension across his shoulders, and above all, the complete absence of hesitation in the moment he turned away from certain victory. He hadn't been scored on the outcome at all. He'd been scored on the choice, and on how fast that choice arrived, and on how little calculation showed anywhere in his face while he made it. The magistrate's voice continued from above. 3 names appear in the full record of this trial's true completion, he said. A Korati ascetic from the age of drought, a young heir 3 centuries gone, a hermit from the final era before the founding, none of them in all that history an outworlder. Until tonight, the projection faded. Marcus stood alone in the chamber with the scorched metal fragment still clenched in his fist, and the torch guttering beside him, and above, in the gallery, he heard the particular silence of several hundred Karathi nobles who genuinely did not know what to say to each other. Naira Varn walked into the chamber alone. The green had drained from her skin further than he'd ever seen it, almost the pale gray of riverstone at her temples now. She stopped 5 meters off and looked at him with an expression he had no reference point for at all. "Did you know?" she asked quietly, in the old tongue, "that it was the gate?" Marcus answered in Terran, the only language that was fully his. "No," he said, "I just couldn't leave her there." The court's reaction unfolded in stages. First came silence, a long, uncomfortable stretch in which 600 Karathi nobles were being asked, all at once, to reassemble everything they'd ever assumed about an entire other species inside the space of a few held breaths. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It felt considerably longer than that to everyone present. Then came the sovereign himself. The old man rose from his seat in the gallery, descended the long stone steps to the chamber floor, where Marcus still stood, and embraced him in full view of the entire court, without ceremony, without warning. The sovereign of the Karathi dominion, who had embraced no outworlder across 40 years on that low chair, wrapped his arms around Marcus Reyes and held him there a long moment. When he stepped back, he pressed his open right hand flat against Marcus's chest, directly over the heart, and left it there. "My son," the old man said, first in the old tongue, then again in Terran, so there could be no possible mistake about it. "My son." Some nobles bowed, others simply stared. 2 men near the back of the gallery, the heads of House Kestrel and House Vale, did neither. They stood without moving, without bowing, without staring, and simply watched, filing the moment away for later use. Marcus, even through the haze of exhaustion pressing in around him, noticed them doing it. He'd remember them for a long time after. Naira stood apart from all of it. Her father hadn't looked at her once through the entire scene. The court hadn't looked at her either. Every trace of green had drained from her skin now, leaving something almost translucent behind, like water held up against a light source. She said nothing. She didn't move. She simply stood there and absorbed in full public view the total reversal of everything she'd said aloud 3 nights earlier. And Marcus, even with the sovereign's palm still pressed to his chest, couldn't stop being aware of exactly where she was standing. They led him afterward to a small cedar-lined robing chamber at the citadel's eastern end, where ceremonial garments were kept for state occasions. F-servants were already laying out a wedding robe cut for a human frame it clearly hadn't been designed for, doing their best regardless. Esh, the old garden servant, stood quietly in one corner without speaking, though she met his eyes once when he entered and held the look a full breath longer than seemed accidental. Naira came in behind the servants and waved them out. Eshi lingered by the door until Naira turned and fixed her with a look, at which point the old woman bowed and withdrew, pulling the door shut behind her. The 2 of them stood alone in the cedar-paneled room. Naira studied him for a moment, visibly gathering herself, and then said what she'd clearly come to say. "I will grant you 3 coastal estates," she said, voice low and carefully controlled. "Gold equal to the full annual tribute of the southern provinces. 3 vessels from the fleet, along with crews to run them. I'll grant you anything within my power to grant. I'm asking you plainly to release me from the oath." Marcus didn't answer right away. He was looking at the robe laid across the chair. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about the offer. "Would you have released me?" he asked, "if it had gone the other way?" He watched her face while she formed an answer, and watched that answer die before it reached her mouth. The green deepened sharply along her collarbones again. She looked away toward the wall. "No," she said. "I didn't think so." He turned to face her fully. He was exhausted, ribs aching, one eye swelling nearly shut from the 3rd fall in the arena, and he hadn't slept more than 2 hours across the last 3 days combined. What he said next, he said quietly, because quiet was all he had left in him to give it. "I won't hold you to anything you don't choose for yourself," he said. But the oath was spoken publicly. The full court heard it. The hall heard the word forever come out of your mouth. "We're going to have to go through with the ceremony regardless. Whatever exists between us afterward, inside whatever room we happen to be sharing, is entirely yours to decide. I won't press you for anything. I won't touch you unless you offer it first. I'm not asking you for anything beyond what you're willing to give." She stayed silent. "But the ceremony happens," he said. I've got a delegation depending on it. You've got a court depending on it. Both of those things need this to go forward. Everything else belongs to you." She looked at him then, for the first time since the throne hall, entirely without contempt in it. She didn't speak. She gave the smallest possible nod, turned, and walked out of the room. The wedding took place at dawn. It was, by a wide margin, the strangest ceremony Marcus had ever attended in his life, and he happened to be the groom standing at its center. Karathi weddings had no kiss, no exchange of rings. Instead, there were silver ribbons braided through the bride's hair by her mother's closest surviving female relative. For Neera, that meant a stern aunt from the eastern branch of the family who clearly disapproved of the whole arrangement and made no attempt to hide it. There was a single cup of dark wine poured at the altar, shared symbolically between bride and groom, without either of them ever actually drinking from it, then set down untouched. There was a long recitation of an ancient oath, spoken entirely in a language Marcus still barely understood, though he managed his responses in the right places because a very patient magistrate had coached him through the sequence 20 minutes beforehand. In the front row of witnesses sat an old noblewoman from the ruling council, watching Marcus with a steady, evaluating gaze the entire time, perhaps 90 years old, perhaps considerably older, skin gone nearly white with age, eyes that had already watched 3 separate sovereigns take that low seat in the throne hall. When the ceremony concluded, she nodded once to herself, a small private gesture nobody else seemed to catch. Marcus didn't know her name yet. He would learn it eventually. It was Ophelia Kest. The wedding feast followed in the great hall. Marcus sat at the high table wearing a robe that fit him badly and eating food entirely unfamiliar to his palate, while a steady procession of nobles filed past to test him with loaded questions about human politics, human physiology, human endurance under pressure. He answered every one plainly and without flourish. After the 5th noble walked away visibly unsatisfied with how little performance he'd offered them, Neera, seated beside him, finally spoke for the first time since the ceremony's end. "You're not entertaining them," she observed. "No, they wanted a performance. I know. They'll talk about you regardless. Let them." She glanced sideways at him, took a slow sip from her own cup, and said nothing further for the rest of the feast. Twice, though, he caught her gold eyes on him from the side, and didn't turn to meet them either time. The bedchamber they were shown to afterward was large enough to double as a small hangar, a ceremonial space more than a genuinely private one. A canopied bed at its center broad enough to seat 5 adults comfortably, tall windows opening onto the eastern gardens. Servants had already laid out wine, fruit, a set of ritual oils along a low table. Neera stopped in the doorway and didn't cross the threshold. "You'll sleep elsewhere," she said. "Understood." He took a pillow and a blanket off the enormous bed, walked out and down the corridor, and found an unused study 3 doors along. He lay down on the cold floor beside the empty hearth, still in his ill-fitting robe, because nobody had thought to provide him a change of clothes, and slept for the first real stretch he'd managed in 3 days. In the bedchamber, Neera sat on the edge of that oversized bed for a long while afterward. She didn't undress, she didn't sleep. She simply sat and thought, while outside the tall windows the eastern gardens slowly began turning green with the first light of the coming morning. She rose before the servants did. She walked the corridor until she found the unused study, and stood in the open doorway looking at the human wrapped in a blanket on the cold stone floor. He was already awake. He looked up at her without sitting up, without pretending he'd been anywhere else all night. "The kitchen should be open by now," he said. "I could use a cup of water if you're headed that direction." She held his gaze a long moment and didn't answer. She turned and walked away. He got up and went to the kitchens anyway. He found the head cook there, a stout, middle-aged Karathi man, and the two of them drank water together while the cook explained, at Marcus's genuine prompting, exactly how the palace's ancient bread ovens vented their heat through the old stonework. The cook talked for a solid 20 minutes. Marcus listened the whole time, and he wasn't performing interest for anyone's benefit. He was actually interested. When Neera passed the open kitchen doorway an hour later, she saw him seated at the worn table, head tilted at the exact same angle he'd used inside the turning halls. Listening for airflow he couldn't see. He wasn't performing for the cook. He wasn't performing for her either. He had no idea she was even standing there. She lingered in the doorway a moment the cook never noticed, then walked on without a word. The sovereign summoned them both before midday. He carried news out of Ashvale Reach, an outer mining colony 3 weeks' travel from the capital, home to some 800,000 Karathi settlers sitting atop deposits of a rare mineral the Dominion badly needed. The colonial governor had been reporting low-grade civil unrest there for the better part of a year. Over the past month, that unrest had sharply intensified. The latest dispatches used the word rebellion, though the dispatches themselves read vague in that particular way. Dispatches always go vague when a governor is trying hard to shape the story ahead of the facts catching up with him. The sovereign wanted Neera present for the negotiations. She was heir, and she'd been trained precisely for work of this kind. He also wanted Marcus at her side. Officially, the sovereign said as the human ambassador present in an observational capacity. Unofficially, Naira asked. Her father held her gaze a long moment before answering. Unofficially, he said, because I trust him. Naira didn't respond to that at all. The cruiser Meridian's Rest departed the capital 3 mornings later, a vessel of the Old Dominion line, some 400 meters stem to stern, crewed by a little over 200 souls. Naira took the royal suite on the command deck. Marcus was assigned quarters 2 levels down in the officer's wing, which told him considerably more about his real standing aboard that ship than any diplomatic briefing ever could have. He didn't complain about it. He unpacked his single bag and went hunting for the engineering deck instead, on the reasoning that a man who doesn't know the shape of the vessel he's riding is a man who can be caught badly off guard by it. He found engineering short-handed. A quiet reshuffling had apparently happened in the weeks before departure, 2 senior engineers reassigned elsewhere without much explanation. The chief engineer was competent, but was covering a watch that really needed to be split 3 ways instead of 1. Marcus stood by the aft coolant manifold and watched a junior crewman chase a slow leak for the better part of 10 minutes before he stepped forward. Silently and pointed at the fitting the crewman had been looking straight past the entire time. The crewman stared at the fitting, then at Marcus, then tightened it. The leak stopped. Marcus went back to his quarters and didn't mention it to anyone. F3 evenings later, over a formal dinner in the officers' mess, the chief engineer brought up the repair log during casual conversation. She'd noticed the aft coolant fix logged under the human ambassador's name of all things and raised her glass down the table toward him in acknowledgement. Naira, seated at the head of that same table, looked at Marcus for a long beat, as though seeing him for the first time. She said nothing about it, but later that evening, walking back to her quarters, she took a longer route than strictly necessary, one that carried her past the engineering deck's observation window. She didn't go inside. She stood there a while watching the crew work the coolant array, and wasn't entirely sure, when she finally turned and continued on, exactly what she'd been looking for. The days of the voyage began piling up small, unremarkable weight. Marcus passing her a cup of tea at breakfast without looking up from his tablet, and her accepting it without comment. A newly promoted officer speaking too sharply to Marcus, across a conference table about what he called human procedural arrogance, and Naira silencing him with a single low word in the old tongue before she'd fully thought about doing it. The officer went pale, the rest of the table noticed, and Naira spent an hour alone in her cabin afterward, furious with herself and unable to fully explain why. The crew started noticing her, noticing him. Rumor moves through a ship's corridors the way water moves through a hull, quietly and everywhere at once. Within a week, half the crew of the Meridian's Rest had quietly revised their opinion of the new human ambassador. Within 2 weeks, even the officers who'd privately considered the marriage absurd had started greeting him in the corridors, the way they'd greet any officer of standing. He was still sleeping 2 levels down from her. That hadn't changed. What had changed was that nobody aboard was entirely certain anymore that it should stay that way. Not every officer came around quietly, and one confrontation in particular stayed with Marcus longer than he expected. F.A. Senior Lieutenant named Terrell Ashen, who'd served aboard the Meridian's Rest since before Naira was old enough to hold rank herself, cornered Marcus in the aft observation gallery on the 11th day of the voyage and made his objections plain without any pretense of diplomacy. He didn't raise his voice. That Marcus would learn wasn't how the oldest and most dangerous disagreements played out among the Karathi officer class. The quieter a man got, the more seriously the room was expected to take him. You understand, Ashen said, that every human ambassador before you has served roughly 11 years, on average, before retirement or reassignment. Her Highness will outlive you by nearly 4 centuries. You will be a single short chapter in a book she has not yet finished a tenth of. I understand the math, Marcus said. Then you understand what you're asking her to carry. Once you're gone, 400 years of grief for 11 years of company, if you're fortunate enough to get even that long. Marcus considered the man for a moment before answering, the same way he'd have considered a support column he suspected of carrying more load than its rating allowed. I'm not asking her to carry anything, he said finally. She's the one who invoked the right. She's the one who chose the terms. If there's grief coming for her at the end of this, it was hers to walk into before I ever had a say in it. All I can control is what I do with however much time actually gets handed to the 2 of us. I'd rather spend that time well than spend it apologizing in advance for the day it ends. Ashen didn't have an answer ready for that, and he left the gallery without offering one. Word of the exchange reached Naira within the day. Ships carried rumor exactly as efficiently as they carried water through a hull. After all, and she never mentioned it to Marcus directly. But 3 nights later, at the officers' formal dinner, she seated Terrell Ashen 2 places further from the head of the table than his rank technically called for, and nobody aboard the Meridian's Rest needed the gesture explained to them twice. On the 9th night of the voyage, Naira couldn't sleep. She walked the ship's upper galleries alone, the way she'd walked palace corridors alone since childhood, and eventually found herself on the prow observation deck, a long, narrow chamber with a single curved window filling the entire front of the ship, stars sliding slowly across the glass, the only light coming from those stars and a single low reading lamp. Marcus was already there, seated at the reading desk with a handheld slate in front of him, shoulders set in a way she'd begun recognizing the posture of someone working through a calculation, not idly reading. He looked up when she entered but didn't stand. "I can go," he said. "No." She stood in the doorway a moment longer, then crossed the length of the deck and sat in the chair opposite his, not close, not distant. She watched the stars through the curved glass for a while, and he let her without filling the silence. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked. He didn't ask her to clarify what she meant. "I couldn't leave her there," he said. "You knew the path to victory was about to close." "Yes." "You walked away from it regardless." "Yes." She was quiet a long time. "My father told me once," she said, "that the true measure of a person is what they do when no one is keeping score. I didn't understand him, not for years. I didn't understand him fully until I watched you in that chamber." Marcus said nothing. He set the slate down, folded his hands in his lap, and looked out at the stars. "I had a sister," he said quietly. Her name was Lena. She lived aboard an orbital station above a colony called Westbrook. 12 years ago, the station caught fire. 300 people aboard. She could have taken the first evacuation shuttle out. She didn't. She went back into the fire and pulled 2 children out of a maintenance bay. She never made a second trip. He was quiet a moment. "This piece of metal I carry," he said, touching his pocket without quite pulling it out. "The one I used on the brackets in the 3rd trial. That's a fragment off the hull of her station. I picked it up off the ground at the crash site myself. It's been in my pocket for 12 years since." Naira was watching him now, very still. "My wife died 18 months ago," he continued. "Her name was Claire, not aboard a ship, in a hospital. A slow illness. I watched it take her, piece by piece, over the better part of a year. Nobody on the delegation knows that. I haven't told anyone since I boarded the shuttle to Oraloon. I'm telling you now because you asked why I did it. I did it because I couldn't stand to watch one more woman die in a room while I walked away and let it happen." He didn't look at her while he said it. Naira didn't speak for a long stretch. When she finally did, her voice had changed entirely. Lower, steadier. Not the voice of the princess who'd insulted him in the throne hall. Not the voice of the woman who'd tried to buy her freedom in the cedar-paneled room. Something that sounded for the first time entirely her own. "My mother," she said, "was named Sylvain Varn. She was the sovereign's wife and my mother, and the one person in this world I trusted completely. She died on a colony called Corvus 7 10 years ago now. There was a rebellion there. She'd gone as a negotiator. The rebels seized the negotiating chamber and killed everyone inside it. She was 51 years old. My father has never fully recovered. I was 15. She looked down at her own hands. I've spent 10 years, she said, watching my father try to open this dominion to outside worlds, watching him fail at it again and again, watching his own court quietly resist him at every turn, watching the old houses simply wait him out. 10 years being the daughter of a sovereign too soft in their eyes to properly hold his own court in line. I was angry the night you arrived, angry at my father, not at you. What I said about your species that night was aimed at him. You refused to give me the one thing I actually needed from you, which was an argument to fight back against. I haven't been able to stop turning that silence over in my mind for 3 days straight." Marcus was looking at her fully now. Neither of them moved. Neither crossed the space still separating their 2 chairs. The green along her throat, pale through their entire conversation, deepened now past anything he'd seen in the throne hall the night of the insult, nearly black along the hollow of her collarbones. She stood abruptly and crossed to the doorway, stopping there with one hand braced against the frame. "Good night, Marcus," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name at all. "Good night, Naira." She left. He sat at the reading desk a long while afterward, watching the stars slide past, and didn't pick the slate back up again that night. 3 days later, Asheville Reach filled the forward viewports, a colony of low stone towers and long white roads carved through open dust country. The governor's welcome arrived by comm laser and was, on its surface, absolutely flawless, perfect diplomatic phrasing, a properly appointed honor guard, transport timing to the surface calculated down to the minute. Marcus listened to the welcome message from the back of the bridge, and something in him, the same instinct that reads stress in a structure before the structure ever actually fails, told him the whole thing was simply too perfect to be entirely genuine. He went back to his quarters and pulled the colony's transit records out of old habit. 3 of the governor's personal guards had logged inbound travel from a system with no legitimate reason to appear anywhere on that manifest. He brought the anomaly to Naira before the honor guard finished boarding. She studied it on his slate for a long minute, already dressed in formal state attire. dark green over silver, hair braided in the royal style. Her expression didn't shift once while she read it. She'd grown up in a court where manifest irregularities were often the very first public sign of treason underway. "You're certain?" "I'm certain of the data. I don't know yet what it means." "It means," she said, "that I'm being walked directly into something." She considered the problem for perhaps 3 full breaths. Then she looked up. "We go down regardless." "Understood. You stay beside me the entire time." "Yes, my guard doesn't hear about this." Agreed. She didn't bother explaining why her own honor guard wasn't to be trusted with the information. She didn't need to. A princess raised inside a court where manifests were routinely altered by rival houses already knew better than to place full confidence in soldiers assembled at the colonial level outside her own direct command. The manifest anomaly, it would turn out, wasn't evidence of a rebel plot at all. Whatever rebellion the reports described, it wasn't the real threat waiting on the ground. The real threat sat well above the governor's pay grade entirely. They took the shuttle down at midday. The welcome was exactly as advertised, 40 Karathi soldiers in full ceremonial plate, the governor in a long cream robe smiling at the base of the landing ramp, a banquet already laid out in the colony's great stone hall by a cook flown in from the capital specifically for the occasion. 200 guests drawn from the local minor nobility, the mining guilds, and 3 visiting trade delegations filled the hall. Marcus stood at Naira's right shoulder in a dark ambassador's robe tailored for him during the voyage, and he watched the room the way he'd learned to watch any room in this world. Reading exits, reading the 4 men along the east wall who weren't dressed as servants and didn't move like servants. Reading a ceremonial brazier at the end of the high table that stood taller than anything he'd seen in the capital and had been packed with coals arranged with far too much precision to be accidental. The governor delivered a speech that said essentially nothing. Marcus was watching the brazier when the charge went off. It detonated at precisely the moment the governor's speech reached, the point where a formal toast would ordinarily be called. The exact instant a noble audience's collective attention would be fixed entirely on the governor, and nowhere near that brazier. Marcus was already moving before the sound of the blast reached the walls, hand already closed around Naira's arm, pulling her down behind the overturned stone of the high table as the shockwave rolled through the hall. The room dissolved into smoke and screaming. Marcus heard the 4 men along the east wall open fire with pulse weapons, not scattered, not panicked, aimed with clear discipline at one single target. That target was Naira. He pulled her further behind the heavy stone of the high table and read the room the way he'd read a building in structural collapse. Airflow through the shattered braziers, pressure dropping across the broken ceremonial windows, stonework holding along the east wall, cracking badly along the north. A service quarter behind the high table leading to the kitchens, which led in turn to a maintenance shaft, which led down and out. "With me," he said. She went with him. They crossed the kitchens at a flat sprint, 2 of the 4 gunmen breaking off to follow. Marcus took the first down with a stone pestle grabbed off a counter, low across the shin, then across the throat, a move that surprised him almost as much as it surprised the gunman. The second man managed to get off a shot that missed them both by a margin. Marcus chose not to think too hard about afterward. He found the maintenance shaft, pried the panel open with a tool he technically shouldn't have been carrying to a formal state banquet, and didn't bother explaining, and the 2 of them went down. 2 levels down, they came out into the old city, not ruins exactly, but foundations, long vaulted tunnels of dark stone cut by some earlier colonial generation and abandoned wholesale when the current city rose above it. The tunnels ran cool, smelling of old standing water and undisturbed dust, appearing on no current map anyone had bothered to keep. Marcus pulled her into a side chamber, eased her down against the stone wall, and examined her shoulder, a clean graze along the collarbone where a pulse bolt had caught her before he'd managed to pull her fully down. "Let me see it. It's not deep. Let me look." She let him look. It wasn't deep, a clean pass of a pulse bolt through soft tissue, cauterized by the weapon's own heat on its way through. It would need proper clamping and addressing before blood loss became any real concern, but she wasn't going to die from it. He'd feel dressed wounds like it before, more than once. He took the scorched metal fragment out of his pocket, the piece of his sister's orbital, the same one that had torn through the Mercy Gate's iron brackets 3 weeks earlier, tore a strip off his own sleeve, used the fragment as a brace along the wound's edge, and wrapped the cloth tight enough to close the bleeding. Naira watched him work the entire time without flinching once. When he finished, she spoke. "Do you regret it? Winning?" He looked at her hand still resting on her shoulder. "I regret," he said, "that it had to cost you something." Above them, in the tunnels, they could hear the gunmen searching. Voices and footsteps carried strangely long and distorted the way sound travels through an old cistern. The 2 of them held very still against the cold stone and listened. F2 of those voices, Marcus realized, didn't belong to gunmen at all. They belonged to people considerably further up the chain, men giving orders rather than following them. Marcus could tell by how the gunmen responded to the tone. Naira could tell by the actual speech patterns. She recognized both voices before he'd fully placed the distinction. Kestrel, she said quietly. And Vale? Marcus nodded slowly. Both houses, she said, my father's oldest and most patient opposition. The colony's rebellion, Marcus said, was invented to bring me here, bring us both here, somewhere the killing could plausibly be blamed on the locals afterward. They listened a while longer. The voices moved off. The gunman followed. Naira stared at the wall across from her, thinking hard. We need word to reach the loyal fleet, she said. If I die on this colony with no accurate account reaching the capital first, my father will be told the settlers did it. Kestrel and Vale will see to that personally. It will be Corvath 7 all over again, a rebellion blamed on people who had nothing to do with it and a decade of war against the outer colonies to follow. Agreed, Marcus said. We can't fight our way back to the shuttle. No, then what can we actually do? Marcus thought it through. He thought about the manifest anomaly, about the governor's off-book inbound traffic, about the fact that whoever orchestrated this had needed command-level communications routed from off-colony, using in their logs an old relay encryption he'd personally cracked 3 years earlier during a previous posting. For a man who'd since been quietly poisoned on another world entirely. The colony's central relay tower, he said, still runs the old Tellurian cipher. My previous ambassador broke it the year before he died. I was his engineer. I still have the key, which means if we can reach that tower, I can broadcast the conspirators' own orders across the full Karathi military network. Every loyal ship in range hears it directly. Your father hears it. The full court hears it. Kestrel and Vale hear their own voices played back to them. She looked at him and took his hand, not a gesture for anyone else's benefit. A decision? Lead, she said. He led. The relay tower stood at the colony's northern edge, a narrow stone spire threaded with cabling older than most of the buildings surrounding it, built by the original colonial engineers who'd understood correctly the value of putting long-range communications above the local wind line. It had outlasted 3 separate generations of rebuilding around it, because the colonists had simply never quite managed to build anything better. The conspirators clearly understood the tower's importance too. 8 men had been posted around its base. Marcus and Naira came at it from beneath instead, through the old city's tunnels, which Marcus recognized from sketches he'd noticed buried in the governor's engineering logs during the voyage out, logs he'd read purely out of habit, the same habit that had already caught the manifest anomaly. He hadn't expected to actually need them. He used them now. They surfaced through a stone hatch in the tower's ground floor, unopened by the sound of it, for the better part of 60 years, groaning like something small and dying when it finally gave. Marcus caught it before it could slam and give them away. Naira climbed through first with a pulse sidearm she'd taken off one of the gunmen back in the kitchens, covering the stairwell while Marcus followed her up. They climbed. The tower held a single spiral stairwell wound around an open central shaft. 2 of the outer guards had come inside. Naira put one down at a landing with a single clean shot through the throat. No announcement beforehand. Marcus took the other with a wrench he'd grabbed in the maintenance shaft. A solid strike across the base of the skull that dropped the man without a sound. On the communications floor, Marcus went to work. The relay hardware was every bit as old as he'd hoped it would be. He cracked the local encryption inside 40 seconds, queried the conspirators' own command channel, captured the reply, looped it, and broadcast their voices, timestamps, and full original orders across every military frequency the tower's array could reach. It went out unencrypted in the clear. It would reach the loyal fleet within 90 seconds. It would reach the capital inside 2 hours. He stepped back from the console. It's done. Naira was watching the stairwell, sidearm still raised, and didn't look at him when she answered. How long? Fleet arrives in roughly 12 minutes. Loyal cruisers already in system first, full response by nightfall. And the men below us, they'll hear the broadcast in about 30 seconds. They're about to know everything's already changed. She nodded and didn't lower the weapon. 30 seconds passed. Below in the tower, they heard the guards work it out for themselves, voices breaking into confusion, then shouting. And through the chaos, one voice cut clean and steady above the rest. Older, deliberate, unhurried. Lord Kestrel, Naira said quietly. He came to this colony himself. He wanted to be present when I died. The old man came up the stairs alone. Marcus could hear him climbing measured, unhurried footsteps. An armored man ascending a stone stairwell without any particular rush. The pace of someone who understood the ending had already been taken out of his hands and intended to meet it standing regardless. Naira recognized the cadence of those footsteps before he'd even rounded the final turn. She'd known him since childhood. He'd held her at her own mother's funeral. He came around the last curve of the stairwell with a pulse pistol in one hand and his other held open, palm forward, in the old karate gesture of parley. Daughter of Varn, he said. Lord Kestrel, the broadcast changes nothing that truly matters. Before the fleet arrives, I intend to have you aboard a shuttle off this colony. His gaze shifted to Marcus. Come with me, he said to her, and your human lives. Refuse, and he dies in front of you, and we negotiate everything else from a considerably better position. Marcus was watching the old man's shoulders, watching the pistol's angle. He read what was about to happen half a second before it actually did. The same instinct that reads stress fractures in a wall before the wall gave way. Lord Kestrel wasn't negotiating in any meaningful sense. He intended to kill the human first, because killing the human first was the fastest way to break the princess's composure and the only path left toward salvaging the rest of his plan. The shoulders had already committed. The pistol was already beginning to turn. Marcus stepped between them, not heroically, practically. The doorway from the comms room into the stairwell was narrow, and he had the better angle on it, and he happened to be the one of the two of them Kestrel wasn't yet aiming at. He stepped into the line of fire half a second before the old man pulled the trigger. The bolt took him low, through the left side under the ribs. He heard Naira's sidearm fire 3 times before he even hit the floor. Lord Kestrel of House Kestrel dropped against the stone wall with 3 clean rounds through his chest, his pistol clattering away down the stairwell ahead of him, and he didn't move again after that. Naira was beside Marcus before Kestrel had finished falling. "Marcus, I'm alive, you've been shot." I noticed. "Hold still." "I am." She had the field kit open in seconds, pulled off the first gunman back in the kitchens, carried the whole way without either of them mentioning it. She worked on him the exact way he'd worked on her in the tunnels 2 hours earlier. Cauterized the entry wound, checked for an exit, cut away the ruined edge of his robe. Her hand stayed perfectly steady throughout. The green along her throat had gone darker than he'd ever seen it, but she didn't cry. She wasn't going to cry. Not with the first loyal cruiser already audible on approach. She was still working on him when its medical team reached the top of the tower stairwell. They flew them both back to the Meridian's Rest. Marcus drifted in and out through most of the first day. The Imperial medics had stabilized him on the cruiser's deck within minutes of pickup, and by the time he surfaced properly, he was lying in a recovery bay aboard ship, with a bandage across his left side and a line in his arm. Naira was seated beside the bed. She hadn't changed out of the clothes she'd worn on the colony. Her shoulder had been freshly redressed. She hadn't slept. He looked at her. "I'm alive," he said. "I noticed." He closed his eyes, opened them again. "How long?" "Nearly a full day. The conspiracy. Kestrel is dead. Vale's been taken into custody. My father has called a full assembly of the court. The wider political fallout will take months to settle. The essential matter, though, is already finished." He nodded. It hurt to. She looked down at her own hands, visibly gathering herself to say something. Marcus already knew what it was before she said it. He let her say it anyway because she clearly needed to. "When we return to the capital," she said, "I intend to go before the full court and formally request the oath be dissolved. It will be granted without difficulty. Ophelia Kest witnessed our wedding. She holds the authority. She'll release me. She'll release you. You'll be free of me. I owe you that much. I owe you considerably more than that. It's what I have left to give you." She looked up at him. "You don't need to answer now." Marcus held her gaze a long moment. He was exhausted. His side ached with every breath. His hands felt strangely distant from the rest of him. But he looked at her and he said what he had to say, because he'd come too far alongside her by then not to say it. "I'm not asking to be released," he said. "I'm asking to be chosen." She didn't answer for a long stretch. She sat very still. Then she took his hand, not the way she'd taken it in the tunnel beneath the colony, which had been a decision about what the two of them were going to do next. This was a decision about what they were going to be going forward. She held his hand and didn't let go for a long time. The Meridian's Rest made the capital 11 days later, and the reception waiting on the ground bore no resemblance to the one that had greeted them on their departure. Where the send-off had been formal and distant, the return was something closer to a reckoning, and Marcus understood within the first hour back on solid ground that surviving Lord Kestrel's ambush had bought them exactly nothing in terms of quiet. The full ruling council convened within 2 days of their landing, all 6 great houses represented, along with a dozen lesser ones drawn in specifically to bear witness. Marcus sat through the proceedings at Naira's side, still moving carefully around the healing wound in his side, and listened to 3 full days of testimony unfold in a language he still only half followed, though he understood enough of the tone by then to track the argument even through the parts his translator lagged behind on. House Vale's surviving members fought hard to frame Lord Kestrel's actions as the isolated decision of one grieving, aging man rather than a coordinated conspiracy between 2 of the Dominion's oldest and most powerful families. It was, Marcus thought, watching the arguments unfold, exactly the kind of defense a structural engineer recognized on site, an attempt to convince everyone in the room that a single failed joint had brought down the whole beam, when the truth was that the load had been miscalculated from the foundation up. The broadcast from the relay tower ended the argument before it could fully take root. Marcus's recording, looped and rebroadcast now across every council chamber in the capital, left no real room for interpretation. Lord Kestrel's own voice, time-stamped, giving orders that named House Vale explicitly as a co-conspirator in the plot, discussing troop movements, and cover stories with the same clinical efficiency he'd have used discussing trade tariffs. By the end of the third day, the council had stripped House Vale of its seat entirely, exiled its 3 ranking members to the outer provinces under permanent watch, and formally absorbed what remained of House Kestrel's holdings into the crown's direct administration, a punishment. Marcus was quietly told by one of the sovereign's aides that hadn't been levied against a ruling house in over 2 centuries. Ashevale Reach itself received something Marcus hadn't expected the Dominion capable of moving quickly enough to offer: a formal, public acknowledgement that the colony's alleged unrest had been manufactured from the capital's own halls, followed within the week by an accelerated resource-sharing agreement that gave the colonists a genuine stake in the mineral wealth they'd spent a generation extracting for someone else's benefit. Marcus suspected, watching Naira push the agreement through committee with a focus that left no room for the usual procedural delays, that she was settling a debt that had nothing to do with him at all, a debt 10 years old, owed to a mother who died trying to negotiate exactly this kind of settlement, and never gotten the chance to see one actually signed. "You didn't have to move that fast," Marcus told her one evening, watching her finally set down the last of the day's paperwork. "I did," she said without looking up. "I've watched this Dominion wait a decade to do the right thing by that colony. I'm done watching it wait." He didn't argue the point. He understood it too well to try. The 2 men who had stood silent and unbowed at the back of the gallery on the night of the Mercy Gate, the heads of House Kestrel and House Vale, watching rather than reacting, while every other noble in the room either bowed or stared, turned out, in the weeks that followed, to have been exactly who Marcus had suspected they were the moment he'd first noticed them filing the scene away. Their fall didn't surprise anyone who'd been paying close enough attention that night. What surprised the court instead was how quickly the old noblewoman Ophelia Kest moved to fill the resulting vacuum on the council with quiet, careful nominations of her own. Nobles who'd shown no appetite for conspiracy, no interest in waiting out a sovereign they considered too gentle for the throne. Marcus asked Naira once whether that had been coincidence. Ophelia Kest, Naira told him, has outlived 4 generations of men who assumed she was C. On the balcony of the Imperial Palace. A full week later, at dawn, they stood together and watched the capital wake beneath them in bronze light. Neither spoke at first. The sun climbed above the eastern towers and caught the green canopy below, holding the color in the leaves the same way it had held the color in the copper-bronze spires the night Marcus first arrived on this world, and the city began, as it did every single morning, to slowly move. Merchants opened their shutters along the lower avenues. The great bells at the ruling council's hall rang the first hour of the day. Somewhere below the palace wall, a Karathi child laughed at something Marcus couldn't see from that height, and the sound carried clean up through the stone in the cool morning air. "My father," Naira said, "finally approved it last night. The full assembly has confirmed it." Ophelia Kest presided over the confirmation herself, the oath reaffirmed. "By choice this time. Both of ours, good." She turned and looked at him directly. "Do you know what they called you?" she said, "in the throne hall, the night we met." "I know." Short-lived, he smiled. The first real smile she'd seen from him since they'd met, and it visibly surprised her. "Yes," he said. "They were wrong about a great many things, but they weren't wrong about that one specifically." She looked out over the waking city. "You won't live as long as I will. You'll be old and gone before I'm even halfway through my own life. I've thought about that constantly for the past week. I've tried more than once to talk myself out of all of this. I can't manage it. Naira, listen to me." She listened. "If I have 50 years with you," she said, "that's more than most of my people manage across 500 years of living. And if I spend every year that follows carrying the memory of you with me, then I will have carried something that was genuinely worth the weight of it. I'm not a fool. I understand precisely what I'm choosing here. I'm choosing it anyway." She placed her hand flat against his chest directly over the heart, the exact same gesture her father had made in the chamber beneath the Mercy Gate, on the day Marcus had won her without ever meaning to win anything at all. He covered her hand with his own, and they stood there together for a long while after that. The scorched fragment of his sister's orbital was still in his pocket, right where it had ridden for 12 years, pressed against his hip. He could feel it there without needing to reach for it. He didn't reach for it that morning. He didn't need to, not today. Below them, the capital carried on with its ordinary morning. The sun kept climbing. A faint spiced wind moved through the terraced gardens, and somewhere down in the courtyard, a small flock of the long-necked green birds the Karathi kept as palace fixtures lifted off together in one smooth rising turn, wings catching the early light all at once. Marcus and Naira stood on that balcony and watched the birds climb into the brightening sky, and for a long while after that, neither one of them said anything else at all. There was nothing. The anniversary of the Rite of Three arrived quietly. The way most true turning points in a life do not with the fanfare of the original event, but with an accumulation of small, ordinary details that only revealed their weight in hindsight. Marcus stood again in the Citadel's eastern gardens in almost the exact spot where Esha had found him the night before his first trial, and found that the spice on the evening air smelled the same as it always had, though he no longer had to reach for the name of it in his memory. It was called Villain Bloom, and it only opened its scent after dark, and he'd learned that fact somewhere in the last year without noticing exactly when the learning had happened. He'd learned a great many things that way over the past 12 months, not through deliberate study so much as through simple accumulation. The way sediment builds a riverbed without announcing each individual grain. He could read the old Karathi script now, slowly, the way a child reads, sounding out characters that had once looked like decorative scratches on stone, and now resolved into meaning, without him consciously translating anymore. He knew which nobles in the ruling council could be trusted with an unfinished thought, and which required every sentence handed to them fully formed and defensible. He knew the sound the palace made settling at night, the particular groan of old stone cooling after a hot day, indistinguishable now from the sound his own childhood home used to make on Earth, decades and light years removed from this garden. Ishe found him there again, an older woman still working the same garden she'd worked for half a century. Though she moved more slowly now than she had the night she'd first told him no outworlder had ever survived the first trial. "You're still standing in this garden at dusk," she said, settling onto the same low bench she always favored. "A year on and still the same habit. Some habits are worth keeping." She studied him a moment, the same evaluating stillness from that first night. "You know, human, that I told you the truth that evening. No outworlder had ever survived the first trial. None had ever triggered the third. I did not soften either fact for your comfort. I remember. I tell you now a third truth, since you're still here to hear it. No outworlder has ever been asked back to stand in this garden a full year later and simply exist in it with nothing being tested and no court watching." She reached up and plucked a single Villain bloom from the vine beside her, turning it slowly between two fingers. "That, I think, is the truth that actually mattered in the end. Not the trials. The staying afterward." Marcus thought about that for a long moment, watching the last color drain out of the western sky above the bronze spires. "I used to think surviving something was the hard part," he said finally. "The trial, the fight, the moment where everything is on the line and you either come through it or you don't. I've started to think the staying is actually harder. The trial only asks for one version of yourself for one specific stretch of time. Staying asks for every version of yourself indefinitely, with no ceremony marking the end of it." Ishe nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd already privately concluded. "Then you understand," she said, "why the old legends never bothered writing songs about what happens after a hero wins. Winning has a shape, a beginning, a middle, an ending everyone can point to and applaud. What comes after has no shape at all. It simply continues day after day until it doesn't." She rose, brushing her skirt smooth, the small evening ritual of a woman who had spent her whole life tending things that outlasted her by decades. "Your wife understands this better than you do, I think. She has watched her own father continue, year after year, long after his own great trial ended in loss, rather than victory. She has been studying what continuing looks like her entire life. You have only had a year of it." She left him with that, walking back toward the servants' quarters at her own unhurried pace, and Marcus stood alone in the garden a while longer, turning her words over the way he turned over a stress calculation that hadn't quite balanced yet. Efnaira found him there some time later, having finished whatever business had kept her in council chambers past the dinner hour. She didn't ask what he'd been thinking about. She simply stood beside him at the balustrade, the same spot he'd occupied his very first night on this world, looking out over the same city, and after a while she reached over and took his hand without either of them commenting on the gesture at all. "The council approved the Ashvale resource sharing extension today," she said. "Unanimous. Even the houses who fought me on the original agreement voted for it this time." "That's good news." "It is." She was quiet a moment. "My mother would have taken 30 years to get a unanimous vote on something like that. I got it in one." "You had help she didn't have?" "I had a broadcast tower and a dead conspirator's own recorded voice," she said. "That is not quite the same as help. That is closer to luck. Luck is what you call the moment before you understand it was actually preparation." Marcus said, "You'd already built the case for that agreement in your head, years before Kestrel ever gave you the leverage to force it through. The tower just handed you the timing. You did the actual work yourself over a decade, whether anyone in that council chamber wanted to admit it or not." She looked at him sideways, the same evaluating look she'd given him across a dinner table, full of nobles testing him with loaded questions, over a year earlier now. "You have gotten better," she said, "at saying the correct thing at the correct moment. I do not remember you being quite this deliberate with your kindness a year ago. A year ago, I hadn't learned yet which moments actually needed it." She let that sit between them for a while, watching the capital's lights come up gradually across the darkening city below, one district at a time, the way they always did. Somewhere down in the streets, the same evening bells that had rung the morning after their wedding rang out again now, marking the day's last formal hour, and neither of them moved to go back inside right away. 50 years, she said eventually, quiet enough that he almost missed it under the sound of the bells. I did the calculation again last week. If your people's usual span holds, and if nothing unexpected takes you sooner, we have perhaps 50 years left together out of the several centuries I'm likely to see through to their end. You've done that math before. I do it more often than I probably should. She turned to face him fully. And every time I finish the calculation, I arrive at the same answer I arrived at on the balcony last year. 50 years with you is worth more to me than 500 without you would have been. I do not need to run the numbers again to know that. I'll only run them because some part of me still cannot quite believe I'm allowed to be this certain about anything. Marcus reached over and covered her hand with his, the same gesture from the balcony a year earlier, worn now into something closer to habit than ceremony, though it had lost none of its weight for the repetition. Then stop running them, he said. Some structures don't need to be recalculated every time the wind picks up. Some of them were built right the first time, and the only thing left to do is trust the work. She didn't answer him directly. She simply leaned into his shoulder the way she had on the observation deck of the Meridian's Rest a year earlier, and the two of them stood there together as the last of the daylight finally gave out over Araloon, the bronze spires going dark and quiet against the sky, filling slowly with unfamiliar stars that Marcus, a year in, had finally started learning the names of one by one.